Welcome to Consortium News, CN Live. I'm Kathy Vogan.
And I'm Joe Lauria, the editor-in-chief of Consortium News. We're back again to discuss the case of Dan Duggan, an Australian pilot, former U.S. Marine aviator, who the United States wants Australia to extradite for allegedly breaking a U.S. arms embargo against China. A grand jury indictment filed and sealed in 2017 and discussed on the occasion of Antony Blinken's October 2023 visit to Australia accuses Duggan of providing military training to Chinese pilots at the Test Flying Academy of South Africa without obtaining permission from the U.S. State Department. The indictment also accuses Duggan of involvement in a conspiracy to retransfer the ownership of a plane, a 1960s-era T-2 Buckeye, to the Academy, where it would be used for training aircraft carrier landings. Duggan's lawyers say this happened way before Duggan's training was conducted. The indictment lists multiple offences, including money laundering from the proceeds of his alleged crime.
Duggan left the US Marines in 2002 and moved to Australia, where he set up a business of joyrides for tourists called Top Gun Australia. 10 years later, he became an Australian citizen and abandoned his US citizenship on Australia Day, January 26, 2012. Duggan claims, and his flight log allegedly shows, that his casual training gigs for the South African school, a total of 18 hours work, took place after he ceased being a US citizen. It is also claimed by the defence that the impugned school's curriculum is entirely comprised of open source material, that Duggan was training civilians on how to cope with difficult conditions, such as engine stall and landing in mountainous areas such as Tibet. Most surprisingly, the defence reveals that the alleged Chinese aircraft carrier used for Duggan's training was still under construction, thousands of miles away at the time of his lessons.
Consortium News reported live from the Duggan courtroom last week, where his defense argued that because what he's alleged to have done was not a crime in Australia at the time the lessons were conducted, that it should prevent the Australian Attorney General from sending Duggan to the United States because Australia's extradition treaty with the U.S. requires such dual criminality. None of Duggan's fellow Australian trainers have been charged with any crime in Australia, for instance. In their written submissions, the defense argued that the United States had no sovereign control over Duggan by the time he trained the Chinese pilots, because he had become an Australian citizen by then, and that his alleged involvement in a conspiracy to obtain the school's plane was pure fiction, conveniently construed to indict him for conduct while he was still a citizen of the U.S.
Duggan was arrested and imprisoned by Australia's Federal Police 3 years ago and placed in solitary confinement for the first 19 months as a high-risk prisoner. It was 62 days before he found out why. We spoke previously with Duggan's wife Safrine about the catastrophic emotional and financial impact this has had on their 6 children. Today we want to delve into the legal and political issues. Please welcome the Australian Senator David Shoebridge, a former barrister, and John Kiriakou, the CIA whistleblower on torture, who has submitted an affidavit in the Duggan case. Senator Shoebridge, Duggan's defence has requested that the extradition be refused. They say there should never have been a Section 19 extradition eligibility hearing because the Attorney General should have applied the dual criminality test a long time ago and ruled out the extradition. The defence highlighted a conflict between the extradition treaty and Australia's Extradition Act. The treaty demands contemporaneous dual criminality at the time of the offending conduct, whereas the Act demands it at the time an extradition request is received. Why is that important to this case?
Yeah, well, this came about because of an amendment to Australia's extradition laws around about a decade ago, which at the time appeared to be fairly benign. No one really noticed that it wasn't highlighted. And that changed the moment at which you consider the dual criminality being, if somebody who is in Australia is going to be sent to another country to face criminal proceedings, which is what extradition permits, our sense of basic justice says, well, we shouldn't be sending someone from Australia to another country to face criminal proceedings if what they're alleged to have done isn't a crime against Australia's statute books. I mean, I'll give you a very obvious example. There are many countries around the world that shamefully still criminalise same-sex relationships. And there may be countries around the world where that's a crime. It would be, an appalling concept that a country would seek to extradite or successfully extradite someone from Australia to face prosecution in a third country for the crime of being in a same-sex marriage when that is legal and, 100% supported by our human rights frameworks. So, I mean, that's at the core of the extradition treaties that Australia enters into. There are other tests, such as, is there a fair judicial process? Can we have faith in the systems and the like? But of course, things change over time. Something that wasn't criminal 20 years ago may become criminal now. You think about how our laws have changed to respond to increasing concerns about child sexual abuse, and there's been a bunch of laws that have come in to deal with that. Our laws have changed in relation to a number of issues that have come about because of new technology. And so we have things that are against the law now that were not criminal 20 years ago or 30 years ago. And one of the other basic rules about our criminal justice system is you can only be penalised under our law for things that were criminalised at the time you did them. The Parliament can pass criminal laws to make conduct illegal, but it should only operate from the time the law passes into the future. You don't retrospectively make things illegal in Australia because you're meant to be able to operate, within the laws as we understand them. And you don't want parliaments, I can assure you, you don't want, me and others making things retrospectively criminalising conduct you did in the past that wasn't criminal at the time. So two basic concepts. Under the extradition laws, we're only meant to be extraditing people when something is contrary to our law and contrary to the law of the country that's trying to extradite them. It has to be a crime. The conduct needs to be criminal in both jurisdictions. And then there's this absolutely fundamental concept in our law that you don't make things retrospectively illegal. You don't make things illegal in the past if they weren't at the time, because people have a right to, run their lives, organise their affairs in light of the laws as they stand at the time, not what some future parliament might judge them. But you see, what the Parliament snuck through in amendments to the Extradition Act about a decade ago was they said, well, look, yep, sure. If someone's going to be extradited, then it needs to be criminal conduct both in the country that's seeking the extradition and in Australia. Tick. But we're not going to be so troubled about whether or not it was criminal at the time the conduct happened in Australia. We're going to let that ride, and we're going to allow the Parliament to pass new laws, make things illegal now, which weren't illegal at the time the conduct was happened, and provided those laws have been passed by the time the third country seeks the extradition, if it's illegal just at the time the paperwork is filed, and in Dan Duggan's case, it was the better part of a decade, after the conduct, they said, provided it's illegal at the time that the paperwork is filed, then no worries, we'll send them off to America. And, not only is that contrary to the treaty that we signed on extradition, it's also contrary to that basic principle that Australia is not going to punish you for conduct that wasn't illegal at the time you did it, according to our laws. And yet all of this has been run roughshod over in the Duggan case. And I would have hoped the Attorney General would have taken a pretty hard view on this, either the former one or the current one, and said, well, look, actually, we're not going to be sending someone to face criminal prosecution in the United States for something that wasn't a crime under Australian law at the time they're alleged to have done it. That affronts our sense of justice. I tell you what, it affronts my sense of justice. Yeah, that's what's happening in the Dan Duggan case.
Well, this is right. But I mean, there's even this element in American law as well, as John Kiriakou will be able to confirm, but there has to be foreseeability that something is a crime. And that is something there's a parallel there between the case of Duggan and Julian Assange. because Article 7 in European Convention on Human Rights, equated to more or less to the Fifth Amendment, does specify that somebody has to know it's a crime before they think of conducting that behavior. The other thing, of course, is the First Amendment. And in the submissions of Colliery Law, who is defending Dan Duggan, they mentioned these motivational talks that he gave in China in the corporate environments, inspiring teams to succeed, all that kind of thing. If you went to America, that could be considered a violation of his First Amendment rights, free speech rights. But hang on a second, Duggan is exactly like Assange. He is now a foreign citizen who acted abroad. And according to Justice Kavanaugh's rule in the Supreme Court in 2020, June 2020, he articulated what he called long-established laws that foreign nationals who acted abroad don't have rights to any constitutional protection. So, Duggan is having a really hard time. There's no defense at the grand jury stage, only prosecutors. He's not allowed to argue the facts of the case in Australia and then possibly over there. And why wouldn't that be a second deal breaker? That he wouldn't have any constitutional rights because he's no longer a US citizen.
Well, as you know, that question of equality before the law was a key issue in the extradition of Julian Assange. His legal team said, well, if the US government won't agree that a non-US citizen has access to the same constitutional rights as a US citizen in criminal law proceedings, well, then that was a very potential, barrier to Julian being extradited from the UK to the US because it affronts that concept of equality before the law. Mm. If those same concerns arise in Dan Duggan's case, well, then you'd hope that's a matter the courts will take into account in considering whether or not to permit an extradition in Australia, because equality before the law, you think, is a pretty fundamental thing. We shouldn't be sending Australian citizens to any jurisdiction to face criminal prosecutions where they have only half the rights or a whole bunch of rights are missing to allow them to defend themselves when, a citizen of the United States would have a far greater set of rights under criminal law. So if our Attorney General should never permit the extradition of an Australian citizen to the United States, if the United States says, well, actually, sure, send them back to our country. We'll whack them before the criminal courts. We won't afford them any constitutional protections. We won't afford them the same rights that US citizens have because we want to whack them in jail. I mean, that you would think should never happen. But it doesn't seem that those pretty fundamental issues have ever really troubled the mind of either this or the former Attorney General, and I find that quite problematic. But ultimately, it's for the courts to make these decisions based upon how they understand the law to be. I can't, I'm not going to try and substitute my personal views for the views of the court, but these are some pretty fundamental issues. Will the courts permit somebody to be extradited when the alleged conduct that they're said to have engaged in was not against the law at the time, against Australian law at the time they engaged in? I think that's a pretty fundamental issue. Will the courts say that the Extradition Act, as passed by the Commonwealth Parliament, is a valid piece of legislation if the Act is contrary to the provisions of the treaty? Because it's only through the treaty and the external affairs power that the Commonwealth has the power to pass this Act. And if the legislation is contrary to the treaty, well, the courts are going to have to determine whether or not the legislation was valid in whole or in part to make that change. Again, it's for the courts to make these decisions on constitutional law, not for myself. But I think there is a separate political question here, which is, should the Attorney General, who ultimately is a politician and is meant to be representing Australian values, in light of, but making political judgments separate to the legal system, should the Attorney General have ever signed the paperwork to permit the extradition? I think the more we look into the case, the more there are compelling reasons why that shouldn't have happened. And of course, one of the other issues in this is the United States is saying that their criminal law applies to conduct committed anywhere on the planet. And they did that in the Assange case as well. They said we can pass laws in relation to our national security that apply anywhere on the planet. Now, there are some areas where states accept that extraterritoriality. Like, there are occasions where you need to say, well, states can have their criminal laws extend beyond their borders because there's some conduct you really want to capture. And traditionally, that's been conduct like piracy. Piracy at the high seas doesn't happen in any country's jurisdiction. If you're going to have criminal proceedings to bring that to account, well, you need extraterritoriality. Slavery, slavery often happens through third countries, or again, people are transported on the high seas. You traditionally have extraterritoriality to deal with that. But are we going to permit the United States to just say any part of their criminal law, wherever they choose, can apply to anyone on the planet, wherever they are? I think there's got to be boundaries here. And the Duggan case, again, is showing that our government should be standing up for some of those boundaries to protect Australian citizens from the, imperial reach of the United States criminal law.
Senator Shoebridge, what is going on here, really? I have two questions, really. How does this fit in, or does it fit in to the continuous pressure the United States has been putting on Australia to make China an enemy when China is not an enemy of Australia? And why did the Attorney General go along with this, as you were just saying?
Well, I mean, three questions really, aren't there? Why did we change the laws? There seemed to be no compelling reason to change the extradition laws to permit a Duggan extradition, right? So I'm yet to that happened before my time in federal parliament. I've looked into it. There's no compelling reason that was put forward to change the laws at the time. And I think that's a mystery that's still yet to be explained. Why does our Attorney General agree to US extradition requests, and why do they often show so little resistance to US actions? Well, I think, anyone who's observed Australia's international relations over the last 5 decades would say that we are incredibly pliant to the United States. Many of our foreign policy settings aren't really set in Canberra. They're rubber stamped in Canberra, but they're set in Washington, and we do what we're told. And this appears to be, very consistent with that pattern. And it doesn't really matter whether it's Labor or the coalition. They sign on to this. Australia's place in the world is to sort of meekly, politely, and sometimes at incredible expense, follow what the United States tells us to do. And, it's another brick in the wall that I think is being built to make the case for Australia to have a genuinely independent foreign and defence policy and start making some of these decisions ourselves. But, in the context of a lot of the rhetoric that's been coming out of Washington, it's been parroted in Canberra, the capital of Australia, and you hear it come from our security community, defence, ASIO, and all of our security agencies. They are desperately trying to persuade the Australian public that we should join the United States if they choose to go to war with China. And, opening up Australia's real estate to new and expanded US military bases, make our armed forces interoperable with the United States so that we can just slot in as a little dependent unit of a larger US military deployment, make our procurement almost entirely dependent on US military equipment, which of course creates a substantial sovereignty risk if the United States ever chooses not to support our defense equipment in the future. There are all these decisions being made, and separate to that is this massive AUKUS mess, which is tying us into having US and UK designed and largely built nuclear submarines over the next 4 decades at a staggering cost from an Australian's perspective of like 375 billion Australian dollars. Like, it's all of these decisions are being made, and they all take us down the same path: increasing dependence on the United States, less sovereign decision-making about our future being made in Australia. And I think it's an incredibly dangerous and reckless path that the current administration, a Labor Party, the previous administration, the coalition, have been taking us on for decades now.
I don't think there's a good answer to this question, and it applies to a country like Germany as well, where German leaders do things that absolutely hurt German interests but serve American interests. Why are Australian leaders doing this when it hurts Australia? That's maybe an impossible question to answer. There's lots of theories.
Well, you see, you're asking
What some of your theories are.
You're
Sorry?
asking questions that never trouble their minds in Canberra. This is like an accepted starting point of the conversation. It's an a priori assumption that our security and our future is intertwined and enmeshed with the United States. And you're not allowed to question that in Canberra. I would have thought you would know this by now, Joe. You're not allowed to question that a priori assumption, because once you start doing that, once you start asking, well, hang on, why are we doing this? How is this making Australia safe? We live in one of the most geopolitically benign parts of the planet, right? There's the only place really safer than Australia, geopolitically, is New Zealand. And that's only because it's the other side of Australia, right? Apart from that, Australia is in pretty much the most benign part of the planet. We're surrounded by oceans. We have, not just an ocean and a sea, but a massive island archipelago separating us from Eurasia, the Pacific Ocean on one side, the Indian Ocean on the other side, Antarctica to the south of us. The only country, place to be a kind of threat to us is kind of New Zealand or Papua New Guinea, right? And we live in an incredibly benign part of the world, right? So in order for us to be at risk from some conflict with China, the only way we can be at risk in a military conflict with China is if we invite that conflict to Australia, right? We actually say, hang on, here we are, don't forget about us, make us a target, actively make us one of your enemies. And the only way I know to do that would be for us to position a whole lot of United States military bases on our shore, which might be used by the United States if they wanted to have a war with China. Like, that would be the only way of putting us at risk. And that's exactly what we are doing. These bases aren't to protect us. These bases are to protect the United States interests. But the bases themselves, our dependence on the United States, our unthinking support for United States military deployments in the region, they don't make us safe. They are the only potential geopolitical risk. They create the risk. They don't create safety. They create risk. And, but even saying that, or thinking that, it's like the third rail of Australian politics. You're not allowed to say it. You're not allowed to think it. You just have to believe. Like, you wake up in the morning and you believe in, your own personal deity, your own personal savior. You also have to believe unthinkingly and with faith in the United States alliance, because it gets a bit awkward if you start critically thinking about it.
Well, except if you're two former Australian Prime Ministers, Malcolm Fraser, who wrote Dangerous Allies, and of course Paul Keating, who has, spoken and batted off all of the attacks, about us not needing these submarines at all. In fact, a totally different strategy of defence would be more appropriate for us.
I mean, they're looking back on Malcolm Fraser's time. Malcolm Fraser used to put the occasional red line in to our relationship with the United States. He, for example, wouldn't let US nuclear armed B-52s come to Australia. But otherwise, Malcolm Fraser had very much a pro-US lean, pro-US alliance lean. But he put some red lines in. Those red lines have been totally removed off the table by the Coalition and Labor in the decades since. And, I admire Paul Keating's robust opposition to AUKUS, and it reflects my views. It's not in Australia's interest. Why the hell are we doing this, But unfortunately, when he was Prime Minister, he was also very robustly supporting and unquestioningly supporting Australia's military alliance with the United States, US military bases such as Pine Gap. And I like people getting a sort of, robust sense of independence once they leave office. But bloody hell, it'd be nice if occasionally they did it while they were in office as well.
Yes, maybe like Gough Whitlam. But look what happened to him. Thank you so much, David, for that perspective on what's going on. Poor Dan Duggan, probably a pawn in this whole changing relationship between Australia and China.
Yeah.
But let's hope that we get an outcome announced. The judgment was reserved in the court. As I said, the defense are seeking to have the extradition request overturned, but we may see it go to the High Court if we don't get a satisfactory response.
Well, my feeling is either way, it's likely to find its way to the High Court. So this is round one. And, you know, and I just, when I say that, I just think about all of the stress and the anxiety and the cost that puts on Dan's family. You know, I know his wife and his kids, they're under an incredible amount of stress. You know, there's an Australian family here that's literally being ripped apart by these proceedings as well, and we shouldn't forget them. So, you know, I hope all Australians are thinking about that. You know, what should our government be doing? You've got a family in deep distress here, and you would have hoped they're in an Australian family's court, not in the United States military's court, but, you know, such is life.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, John. Sorry I can't stay around for the rest of it, but
That's okay. You've given us plenty of time.
Cool.
Well, John Kiriakou.
Good to see you.
Good to see you. Thanks for coming on. You have submitted an affidavit in the Duggan case. Can you tell it? I haven't had time to look at it because I just got my hands on it. But can you tell us why? What's in there? What can you attest to?
Sure. Well, this actually originated because of a series of articles that I had written for Consortium News back in 2022 and 2023 about the deleterious effects of solitary confinement on the mental well-being of American prisoners. I said that that I had not been subjected to the level of solitary confinement that many other American prisoners had. I spent a total of 9 days in solitary confinement. I needed to lose the weight anyway at the time. I joked, but the truth is, solitary confinement is used in the United States, unlike in any other country in the world. It's used as a form of punishment. And one thing that I think almost no Americans realize is that the concept of solitary confinement as a punishment was actually created in the United States. It was created, and I say this in the affidavit, it was invented in 1829 at the Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. You can still go to Eastern State and take a tour. It's in ruins now. But there were, famous prisoners there like Al Capone and early murderers and people that we've read about in history books. In any event, in 1829, American politicians came up with this idea where they would build this enormous, imposing, neo-Gothic, escape-proof, maximum security penitentiary made of stone. It had just tiny little cells. The guards were in the very center, and the cells went around in spokes, like spokes of a wheel. The idea was that each little tiny cell would have nothing but a bed, a chair, a little table, a small chamber pot, and a Bible, with the idea being that if a prisoner has nothing to do all day long but eat and sleep and read the Bible, that he will come out of prison at the end of his sentence as a good, law-abiding Christian man. And what they found was that instead, everybody went insane. And that's where we first learned of these severe psychological effects that solitary confinement has. It leads to anxiety, depression, paranoia, hallucinations, suicidal thoughts, suicidal actions. So we've known this for 200 years, and we're still using it. And when I say using it, the United Nations has declared the American use of solitary confinement to be a form of torture. And the United Nations has urged all member countries to limit solitary confinement to a maximum of 15 days. Well, here in the United States, we've had people in solitary confinement for as long as 44 years. And so I gave some examples in this affidavit. There was a prisoner by the name of Antony Gay. He was severely mentally ill. He was held in a prison in Colorado and placed in solitary confinement right after his conviction, rather than being placed in a mental hospital where he could have received treatment for schizophrenia, which is what he was suffering from. He was in this small 6 by 10-foot cell, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. He became paranoid. He began self-mutilating. He stabbed himself in the eye with a razor blade. He cut off pieces of his own flesh and ate them. He cut out one of his testicles and hung it on the doorknob of his cell. And then he stitched his scrotum closed with a zipper that he had taken out of his pants. He didn't even realize what he was doing. In all, and get this, this is typical of American prisons. In all, his 7-year sentence was eventually extended to 97 years because he kept doing these things and adding time. And what was his crime? In 1993, he was arrested and charged with stealing a $1 bill out of a restaurant tip jar. 97 years in prison. And he did 2 decades of it in solitary confinement. So in the affidavit, I wrote about 4, 5, 6 of these different cases. And I said, look, because Dan Duggan is a high-profile prisoner, he's going to be placed in either solitary confinement or in something called a communications management unit, which is akin to solitary confinement, where the prisoner is completely cut off from the outside world. And, unless he's stronger than anybody else that I've ever encountered in my life, this is going to have that same kind of deleterious effect emotionally, mentally, on him that it's had on everybody else who's gone through it.
Yeah, what do you think about what I was talking about before with Senator Shoebridge?
Yeah.
The thing that killed the Assange case was that he would be debarred from constitutional protection by way of his nationality alone. And that was a red line for the British court.
Yes, I think that's the strongest argument. And I would even add one. Here in the United States, and Joe, you know this as well as I do, we've discounted criminal intent in this country. Did he intend to violate the law? Obviously not. He likely didn't even know there was a law that governed this kind of thing. And even if he did, he wasn't an American citizen. So it seems to me if the United States is really serious about stopping, let's say, the training of, I don't know, undercover Chinese intelligence officers, they would have asked the Australians to arrest everybody who worked at the flight school, everybody who was training foreign nationals to use these planes, or nobody. But to arrest and then demand the extradition of just Dan Duggan, that just stinks of politics.
Yes, and in fact, I believe it is the Fifth Amendment, although I'm not a total expert on American law, but the bar is reasonable certainty in terms of this foreseeability. That any reasonable person would have known this was a crime, and in fact there are plenty of indications for Duggan that it is not a crime, in his country of citizenship. So you're right, he may not have even known.
And another sad thing here is the Australians have been so weak in the face of U.S. demands, so willing to roll over so far, that this man has been imprisoned now for years.
Yeah.
And he's not even been charged with a crime in Australia.
3 years.
Mm-hmm.
And why I wish Shoebridge was still here to ask if maybe Kathy, Why did Australia put him in solitary confinement? I would imagine the Americans asked him, but I don't know that. Why?
Um, well, first of all, as I said in the intro, Duggan didn't learn for 62 days why he had been arrested. He had no clue. He was clueless, which also points towards his innocence. But I imagine that the Americans would have said he's quite literally a flight risk, seeing he's a pilot.
Ridiculous.
No,
They could have put a bracelet around his ankle, of course, and
Sure. Sure, they
but
could have.
but they, I think it's all for show.
Just
all
as
for
an
show.
aside, Kathy, just as an aside, one of my cellmates at the Federal Correctional Institution at Loretto, Pennsylvania, where I was incarcerated for 23 months, was an Australian national. He was violent. He was a convicted arsonist. And not just an arsonist. He shouted to everybody in the Department of Motor Vehicles in Buffalo, New York, I'm going to come back here and burn this place to the ground, even if people are in it. And what did he do? He came back and he burned the place to the ground. He was never in solitary confinement. He ran back to Australia to escape. The Australians arrested him at the request of the United States. He was never held in solitary confinement. He was finally extradited to the US, where he was placed in a low security prison with me. And then he just quietly did his 5 years and went home. So
Well, I
what
think
makes Dan Duggan so dangerous when
I think
clearly he's not dangerous?
yeah, that's right. But I mean, like Assange, he's a kind of a political prisoner, and
This is a
in
political
those
case.
and those cases, as Stella Assange said, the punishment is the process.
Yes. Yes,
I
that's
want to ask
exactly
you,
right.
John, that was fascinating. That history you gave. 1829. I was just looked up that James Madison died in 1836. So I mean, the guy who wrote the Constitution, and all the rights that this country was going to be different from the tyrannies of Europe. And then in 1829 they came up with this idea. But my question is, why, when they saw that they went insane and they weren't quoting scripture when they came out, why did they continue this? So clearly that wasn't the real meeting, was it?
That's a great question. That's a great question. And the answer is because they decided that it was still effective as a form of punishment. Maybe the rehabilitation part didn't work, but by God, nobody wanted to be in solitary. And so that was a good punishment.
Has it worked as a deterrent?
Absolutely not. No, it's just cruel. That's all.
John, have you been following the case as it's been
have.
going through the courts?
I have, and I've spoken to Safreen. I've spoken to Dan's legal team in Australia and to his U.S. attorneys. I've met them a couple of times here in Washington. They believe that they have a very strong case, but as in the case of Julian Assange or the case of John Kiriakou or anybody else who faces long periods of time in a penitentiary, you might have a strong case, but an American jury would convict a bologna sandwich, as the old saying goes. And you're free to appeal, but you have to appeal post-conviction, which means you do all the time first while your appeal winds its way through the courts. This is a no-win situation. So it has to be nipped in the bud, so to speak, a 3-year delay in the nipping of the bud on the Australia side. If he's extradited to the U.S., he's lost. And I'll tell you another thing too. If he is extradited to the US and convicted, or extradited to the US and takes a plea to a lesser charge, which would still be a felony, he would be banned from visiting the United States for the next 25 years. But he has 8 brothers and sisters, and his parents are still alive, and all of them live in the United States.
Oh, I didn't know that. I mean, he's got 6 children as well.
Right?
A big family.
He has an enormous family, and he would literally never get to see them again unless they visited him in Australia.
Yeah.
And his parents are quite elderly, and they're not going to Australia.
Yeah.
Let me ask you, John, of 2 things. One, I want to ask you in general about grand juries, because there are some people in Australia who are really incensed about this. We are used to
Yeah.
it here in the US. The idea of a
Yeah.
grand jury, that it is a secret, it's always secret, and it always remains sealed. You're not supposed to leak
Yes.
anything from it. Happens.
Right.
How democratic of a process is a grand jury? Why did that happen in the United States? If you know the history of that, I'd be interested. And why is it so useful to the authorities?
You know, I don't know the history of it, but I can give you my own experience with the grand jury. I was arrested in January of 2012 and charged with 5 felonies, including 3 counts of espionage. And I hadn't been indicted by any grand jury. And so when I went to meet my attorneys the first time, one of them said, "Well, wait a minute, wait a minute. What do you mean you've not been indicted?" And I said, "No, they arrested me and they took me in for arraignment. I pleaded not guilty, but I've not been indicted by any grand jury." So my attorneys went to the Justice Department and said, "What is this? Some kind of a circus?" They said, "Fine. You want him indicted? We'll indict him." This is where I learned about the grand jury system. They just called a group of people together. It's like 30 people, and they laid out their case. We had no idea the grand jury was meeting. You're not informed. You're not allowed to speak, even if you were informed. You're not allowed to sit in. You're not allowed to ask questions. You're not allowed to do anything. You have no role. They just give their side of the story, and they say, "Okay, who wants to indict and send him to trial?" Show of hands. And of course, all 30 are going to say, "Oh yeah, this sounds awful. Espionage. Yes. Classified information. Yes, yes, indict." Well, they accidentally leaked the transcript of the grand jury to us. And so I got to see who my friends really were and who my enemies really were. I got to see them by name, former coworkers, colleagues, people I considered to be friends, and I got to read every single word that they said about me. Well, the bottom line is no one stands a chance before a grand jury. Not a chance. It was ugly.
An opportunity to what they thought was complete secrecy. They unloaded on you.
Yeah,
People
and you know what, Joe? One of them, I've become kind of well known, not just in the United States, but around the world over the last 2 years or so, only because I've somehow hit the sweet spot in the YouTube algorithm. And I was on Joe Rogan last week and 2.5 million views. I have a couple of shorts out that have 30, 35, 38 million views. Well, all of a sudden, some of these people are reaching out to me. "Hey, we should do something together. We should do a speaking tour together. Oh, well, why don't we have a debate?" It's like, do you think I don't know what you said about me on March the 6th, 2012? Because I know exactly what you said about me. And now you want me to be your friend? You want me to help you make money? No, thank you.
That was a unique opportunity to learn that kind of thing. Sometimes I think if I'd like to die and then still be able to see what people are saying about me. Read the obituaries.
That's right.
Now you got that chance.
But it's better to see what they're saying about you when you're down.
Oh, and when you're still alive too, because now you can get back in it.
That's right. That's right.
I mean, Kathy, before I turn it back to you, why did this take 15 years with Duggan? I mean, this stuff happened a long time ago. They only indicted him like several years after, 6 years after that, and then nothing's happened until Blinken shows up. The Secretary of State. This shows how political it is. Coming to shore up Australia that they're not getting weak-kneed against China. All of a sudden, that's when it's really unbelievable.
That's it right there. That's it right there, Joe. You hit it on the head. This is about China. This is about a political scalp to show that we're tough against China. There was an indictment here in Washington just a week ago, 2 weeks ago, a former intelligence officer indicted for allegedly passing some sort of analysis to China. He swears he's innocent. He was an employee of a think tank, former like naval intelligence or DIA or something like that. But this is about China. And another thing too, and forgive me if you've heard me say this a million times, because I have said it a million times. But these attorneys, these assistant U.S. attorneys in the Department of Justice, they don't get promoted by not prosecuting you, right? They don't get promoted by not trying to, get you some draconian sentence. They all want to be U.S. attorney. They all want to run for Congress or run for governor or have the corner office in the A level law firm, the big law firm. And so they're going to make that career on your back. And I think that's what we're seeing here. I think that somebody just went through some old files and said, hey, I might be able to make this case. And then we can just say it's a China espionage case, right? And so what? This guy doesn't even love America, they probably said.
Yeah.
He gave up his American citizenship. What kind of American is that? I'm going to go after him and make a name for myself.
Mm.
And then we
Yeah.
have the case.
Mm.
I hate to be so cynical, but I mean, those were the attitudes that I encountered at the Justice Department.
Yeah.
Kathy?
Well, I don't have anything really more to say. Let's just wait and see what the result of this federal court hearing is. We had a strange argument going on there about, when the dual criminality kicks in, or the absence of dual criminality kicks in. Prosecution was saying, oh, it doesn't matter. We can let somebody languish in prison for 2 years before even having an eligibility hearing. It doesn't matter, whereas the defense is saying, as soon as someone is arrested, it has to be deemed immediately. We've got to move into action straight away to determine whether this is an extraditable offense, whether this is an extraditable person, whether there's dual criminality. So, it was a very odd argument. I think that the defense did a fantastic job, and the prosecution, it was so full of sections and subsections, it was really quite difficult to follow. But we'll see presently, but it might take a couple of weeks before the judgment comes out, and that judgment could be that the eligibility hearing that took place last year, a Section 19 hearing, they call it, which determined that he was eligible for extradition, that it will be overturned as the defense requests. There's another story here that I should tell you, is that Duggan had changed his lawyers, right? And so when this Section 19 hearing came up, his new lawyers, which is Colliery Law, Bernard Colliery, the former Attorney General of the Australian Capital Territory, those guys hadn't had enough time to study the case, and they asked the judge for more time to, get on top of it and put forward the right arguments, and the judge refused. And so that when they said, well, we've got no arguments to put forth today, and so the judge deemed him eligible for extradition. That's a bit weird. So
that sounds like pressure from the U.S.
Oh, whatever, but it just doesn't sound like bona fide due process to me. And
I agree.
A scalp to show that we're tough on China, and they even get the judge somewhere. The judge goes along with this. An Australian judge is not. It's beyond words. This
China.
What they'll do to a person, a person's life if it serves a political.
I want to say one other thing very quickly. I understand we're over time, but Safrine, Dan's wife Safrine, has been so steadfast in her support. How this woman has been able to support her husband with the energy that she has, raise 6 kids, try not to lose their farm, engage with attorneys, engage with a public relations person, find American attorneys, lobby politicians. She's like a superwoman. And I think that when he wins this thing, and I really believe that he'll win, it's because of her.
Oh, she was in a very bad way when we talked to her just a few days before the last hearing, and when she started off, she almost broke down immediately, but she is able to pull herself together and speak sensibly and intelligently about it. So,
she's fantastic.
yeah,
Wonderful.
yeah.
Thank you, John. Thank you, John.
Thank
Kiriakou.
you. Good to see you both.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. Bye.